For 3 years, Sam Altman was the most confident man in Silicon Valley, the face of the AI revolution, the guy who stood in front of Congress, shook hands with world leaders, and calmly promised that his company was building the most important technology in human history. That confidence was the entire brand. And this year, for the first time since ChatGPT changed the world, that confidence has visibly cracked. Executives are walking out the door in waves. His own co-founder is suing him in federal court. A major investigative report just accused him of misleading his own board, using internal documents from the people who used to trust him most. And Altman himself, publicly, in his own words, just admitted the company hasn't had its best year. So let's actually dig into what's real here, because the situation at OpenAI right now is genuinely serious, but it's also more complicated, more human, and more revealing than a simple headline claiming the whole company is collapsing overnight. Stick with me, because this story says as much about the entire AI industry as it does about one company and one CEO. Let's start with the money, because at the end of the day, every corporate drama eventually comes back to the numbers, and OpenAI's numbers this year have not been telling a comfortable story. Internal financial documents reportedly show the company expects its losses to roughly triple this year, even as revenue growth, the metric that's supposed to be racing ahead to justify all that spending, has been slowing down. That's a genuinely uncomfortable combination for any company, but it's especially uncomfortable for one carrying a valuation of $852 billion, a number that only makes sense if investors believe explosive growth is coming, not decelerating. OpenAI had reportedly been planning an IPO, a public stock offering, for later this year, something widely viewed inside the company as an eventual exit ramp, a way to lock in that enormous valuation and bring in fresh capital at scale. But according to reporting on internal deliberations, the timeline has come into serious question, with CFO Sarah Fryer and portions of the board reportedly pushing back on both the timing of a public offering and the wisdom of continuing to sign enormous multi-year compute contracts, the deals that lock OpenAI into paying for massive amounts of computing power that could end up costing more than the revenue coming in to cover them for years at a stretch. Reports have also described real friction between Altman and Fryer specifically, with the CFO reportedly being sidelined from some key meetings, a detail that, if accurate, suggests tension not just about strategy, but about who actually has a seat at the table when the biggest decisions get made. Then there's the exodus, and this is the part of the story that tends to grab headlines the fastest, because watching senior leadership walk out the door in waves is one of the clearest, most visible signals something structural is happening beneath the surface of a company. In April of this year, 3 senior executives departed from OpenAI on the exact same day. The company's chief product officer, the chief technology officer overseeing enterprise products, and the head of Sora, OpenAI's video generation model, and one of its most publicly hyped recent products. 3 departures landing on a single day is not a coincidence anyone inside a company waves away easily, and it wasn't the first wave of senior departures OpenAI has weathered either. Going back further, the company has cycled through a striking number of high-profile exits since its dramatic November 2023 leadership crisis, when the board briefly fired Altman entirely before reversing course just days later under pressure from staff and investors, including Microsoft. Ilya Sutskever, OpenAI's former chief scientist and one of its original co-founders, left the following year to start his own AI safety-focused company. Longtime president and co-founder Greg Brockman has also stepped back from parts of his role at various points along the way. Depending on how you count it, OpenAI has lost the vast majority of its original founding team since the company was created back in 2015, leaving Altman as one of the only remaining figures from that original founding group still steering the ship day to day. Now let's get to the part of this story that's genuinely the most serious, and the part that goes well beyond ordinary corporate turbulence. In April, The New Yorker published a lengthy investigation built on more than 200 pages of internal OpenAI documents and over 100 interviews with current and former employees and board members. The picture that reporting painted was not a flattering one. According to that investigation, Sutskever, the former chief scientist, had compiled a 70-page internal document detailing specific instances in which he alleged Altman had misled the company's board on important issues. Separately, the reporting described notes kept by Dario Amodei, another former senior OpenAI researcher who left in 2020 to co-found rival company Anthropic, describing Altman's reassurances on certain critical issues in blunt terms, quoted in that reporting as almost certainly nonsense. That's about as direct and damning as it gets coming from someone who once worked closely alongside him. And this isn't just a story confined to magazine pages and internal memos anymore either. It's now playing out in an actual federal courtroom in Oakland, California, where Altman has appeared as a defendant in litigation brought by Elon Musk, another OpenAI co-founder, who has accused Altman and the company of abandoning the nonprofit, safety-focused mission the organization was originally built around back in 2015. In favor of a far more commercially aggressive, profit-driven direction. That lawsuit remains ongoing, and it's forced Altman to publicly answer under oath for decisions and communications going back years. It's worth pausing here to be genuinely fair and balanced about what all of this actually represents, because it's easy to slide from real, documented problems into a much more sweeping, less accurate narrative that the entire company is on the verge of collapse. It isn't, at least not by any of the metrics that would typically define an actual company collapse. OpenAI still operates ChatGPT, one of the most widely used consumer software products on the planet, with hundreds of millions of active users. It still commands one of the largest valuations of any private company in the world. It still holds deep, active partnerships with major players, including Microsoft, Amazon, and even the Pentagon. Tripling losses and slowing revenue growth is a genuinely serious financial warning sign worth taking seriously. But it is meaningfully different from a company running out of money or shutting its doors, and nothing in the current reporting suggests OpenAI is anywhere close to that kind of existential financial cliff. Where things get more genuinely uncomfortable is the reputational and cultural side of this story, and that's where Altman's own public words become relevant. In a post on X in July, Altman directly acknowledged the company's struggles, telling users plainly that OpenAI hadn't had its best 12 months. That's a notably candid admission coming from a CEO who's spent years projecting almost relentless, unshakable optimism about his company's trajectory, and it lines up closely with what users have actually been experiencing and complaining about throughout the year. Reports of ChatGPT producing blander, less distinctive responses, clunky and frustrating updates to the desktop application, and mounting competitive pressure specifically from rival AI assistants, including Anthropic's Claude and Google's Gemini, both of which have been closing the gap in user perception and, in some head-to-head comparisons, arguably pulling ahead on specific tasks. For a company that spent years positioning itself as the undisputed, unquestioned leader of the entire AI race, that shifting competitive perception, showing up in real user sentiment rather than just internal memos, may end up being one of the more consequential threats the company is currently facing. There's also been ongoing friction around OpenAI's political activities this year, an angle that's gotten less attention than the executive departures and lawsuits, but is genuinely part of the broader picture of a company under mounting external pressure. OpenAI has found itself struggling to distance itself from a pro-AI superpass called Leading the Future, backed by prominent Silicon Valley figures, amid a broader industry backlash over aggressive political spending tied to this year's midterm elections. Being publicly associated with a controversial political spending push while simultaneously navigating executive departures, an internal culture crisis, and slowing financial growth all at once is not exactly an easy position for any communications team to manage. And speaking of that communications team, reporting from the SF Standard in August described the specific difficulty OpenAI has faced trying to fill its top communications leadership role, noting the company has been searching for a permanent chief communications officer since January of this year without landing on a replacement. A striking vacancy for a company navigating this many simultaneous, high-visibility controversies at once. One veteran Silicon Valley communications professional interviewed for that piece offered a memorably blunt summary of what the job has apparently felt like from the inside, describing it in the piece as making the best of a genuinely difficult situation, comparing it to trying to make lemonade out of the worst possible lemons. So, pulling all of this together, what's the actual honest picture here, separated from both the doom and gloom framing and any instinct to wave it all away as normal corporate noise? OpenAI is a company facing a genuinely difficult multi-front stretch, financial losses tripling while growth slows, a wave of senior leadership departures that shows no clear sign of stabilizing, a serious, well-documented investigative report alleging a pattern of misleading behavior from its own CEO, an active federal lawsuit from one of its own co-founders forcing that same CEO to answer uncomfortable questions under oath, mounting user frustration and intensifying competitive pressure from rivals who were considered afterthoughts just a couple of years ago, and even a leadership vacancy in the exact role responsible for managing the company's public image through all of it. That is a real, substantial list of serious problems, not manufactured drama. But it's also worth being honest that OpenAI remains, by almost every external measure, one of the most influential and widely used technology companies on the planet right now, still commanding an enormous valuation, still holding major strategic partnerships, and still shipping products used by hundreds of millions of people every single day. What seems most genuinely true, reading through everything currently on the record, is not that OpenAI is collapsing, but that the era of Altman operating with something close to unquestioned public confidence and total internal control appears to be over. The scrutiny is louder now, coming from former colleagues, from courtrooms, from investigative journalists, and increasingly from Altman's own public acknowledgments. Whether that scrutiny ultimately forces a real course correction, whether the company stabilizes its finances and its leadership team, and whether Altman himself weathers this stretch the way he weathered the dramatic firing and rehiring back in November of 2023 are all still genuinely open questions. But one thing has clearly and visibly shifted this year. The story surrounding OpenAI is no longer purely a story about revolutionary technology and unstoppable momentum. It's increasingly a story about the very human, very familiar pressures that eventually catch up with almost every company that grows too fast, promises too much, and finds itself under a spotlight it can no longer fully control. If this kind of story matters to you, the kind that separates the real documented problems from the exaggerated panic, and actually shows you what's happening underneath the headlines, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this one is still unfolding.